Well, welcome back. We're about to start session 5 of Connected Disciple, which is the third step of creating effective outreach pathways. You've already completed step 1, which was to determine a single and specific whom, and you just finished an exercise where you selected an outreach gateway. Our next step then is to identify, evaluate, and classify outreach activities. Now, remember, our outreach gateway was that activity or ministry that you were doing that you're going to do whether you do outreach or not, but now you're looking at how do we do outreach alongside of or in conjunction with this outreach gateway. In other words, how does this outreach gateway feed people into our outreach efforts? And so in this session, we're going to talk about the things we're doing that are specifically for outreach. Not the outreach gateway, which is the ongoing activity, but what we do as people, make connections or start or nurture relationships through the outreach gateway. So these activities always conducted alongside of the outreach gateway. But they can be standalone ministries or activities. There are things that can be done by themselves, or they can be new activities, new ministries, existing ministries, or all the things going on in our congregation that somehow or another we're going to make use of to either create a connection, nurture a relationship, or bring people into the Word and Sacrament ministry of our congregation. To help us select ministries and activities that will best support a specific outreach effort, we have some outreach activity key questions to consider. Now, there's 7 questions to consider, but if you notice from the diagram, those questions are specific to the type of activities that we're planning. So questions 1 and 2 have to do with the create connections activities. Questions 3, 4, and 5 are focused on the nurture relationship activities. And questions 6 and 7 are in the make disciples activities. But in all those questions, we're focusing on a specific whom. And we're looking at how does each of the activities support one of our aspects of outreach. Always considering the whom's perspective. So question 1. What about this activity would whom find interesting or appealing? And this is a create connections question. So if we're saying, well, this is an activity through which we can create connections with people, we need to look at that activity from the other person's point of view. How would a non-church person in our community, specifically the whom that we've selected, how would that person look at this? How would they perceive it? Because remember, non-church people don't love your church like you do. They don't see it the same way. You see your church as a loving, caring place where you gather around people that support you and care about you. It's a safe place. But from someone outside the church, they may see the church as daunting, intimidating, judgmental, irrelevant. There's all these things that they see in our church that we would argue aren't true, but that's how they perceive it. And we need to consider that as we select outreach activities for creating connections. So what about this would the whom find interesting or appealing? The second question to consider under create connections is how does this activity provide a way for our congregation to continue contact with the whom? Now, just because somebody has come to an event or an activity or made use of the services that we provide, maybe a human care activity we have, doesn't mean that we're going to be able to keep connection with them, keep contact with them. We need some way of gathering their contact information. All sorts of ways can be used, from drawings, raffles, registration cards, enrollment information. But whatever you do to gather contact information, make sure you're asking for it, not insisting, and that you have permission to continue contact with the person, that you're not going to be, like someone on the internet, like a spammer who's just a nuisance and is making unwanted, unpermitted contact. So ask, don't insist. be considerate, and that will help maintain that connection, maintain the ability to connect and contact with this person over the long haul. Now, our third question moves us into the nurture relationships activities. And the question here is, why would whom be interested in participating in this activity? So this gets back to somebody's understanding of this is meeting a need. So which of the needs does it meet? And how does it provide a benefit to the whom that we're reaching out to? And as you think about that, you also want to consider how you can address any stigma about this activity being a church-sponsored activity. Because non-church people will be a little reluctant, often in many cases, to do something just because it's a church activity. And so you want to think about that if it comes across as, quote, too churchy for people in the community. But at the same time, you don't want to do anything that even has a hint of bait and switch. So by bait and switch, we mean that you're inviting people to come to this thing for one reason, maybe meeting one of their needs, something of interest to them, something where they have a benefit, but then you kind of slip something else in place of it or in addition to that. So don't ever fall into the trap of bait and switch. You will alienate the whom you're trying to reach if you use any bait and switch tactics. Question number 4 is also about nurturing relationships. In this question we ask, how does this activity help our members engage whom on an ongoing basis? Our members need to be engaged. They need to be interacting with the whom that we're reaching. So remember that very important adage, churches don't build relationships, people do. Also remember, relationships take time. You're not going to nurture a relationship with the whom at a single event or in a month. It could take a very long period of time and multiple events, ongoing activity and interaction. So relationships take time, and it works best if we move people from fewer to many. In other words, when somebody starts in a nurturing relationship activity, that there are a few members of the congregation that interact with them. And so they're not overwhelmed. But then we move to activities where they're being introduced to and engaging with even more people. And so be intentional about expanding relationships. Probably one of the biggest mistakes congregations make when it comes to nurturing relationships is they look to just a handful of people to build these relationships. Often they look to just the pastor to build the relationships or another church worker. And so all those relationships are invested in one or two people. And if that person leaves, all the relationships are lost. So we want to be very intentional about expanding those relationships so that people that we're trying to reach, our whoms, are building relationships with multiple members of our congregation. And that just doesn't happen by itself. Our next question asks, how have we equipped our members for using this activity to nurture relationships with whom? What comes naturally for some people doesn't happen automatically for a lot of people. They need training, they need guidance, they need support. And if you provide the training, guidance, and support, people will become more comfortable with this starting and building relationships with the whoms we're trying to reach. So think through, what's it going to take to equip our members to help nurture relationships with the whom? Question 6 is, to which entry points into the Word and Sacrament ministry of our congregation does this activity guide whom? So now we're moving from the strength of the relationship that we build with the whom, where there's mutual trust and respect, And through that relationship, there's a level of comfort about being invited into the Word and Sacrament ministry of the congregation. But we want to make sure that we provide multiple ways for people to get involved in God's Word. Right? Remember, many non-church people are intimidated by the church. Now, they're intimidated in different ways. Some because they're sinners and they come to recognize it, and they feel very unworthy, and they feel judged. And on the basis of our relationships with them, they come to learn that they're not being judged by us. Right? Some are intimidated because they just don't know anything, and they're uncomfortable because everybody else seems to be so knowledgeable, and they're not. They may be intimidated because of preconceptions about the church, and our relationships help take away those preconceptions. But once we're there and we're able to invite them into something, we need to invite them into something that is of interest and appealing to them. And so we want to provide multiple ways for people to come into the Word and Sacrament ministry of our church. You know, don't rely only on worship services or only on the pastor's class. Also, don't rely solely on things where they have to come in person. You know, make use of technology. Find a way that the whom will be comfortable starting into God's Word, and use that as a starting point, and we can build on that and expand that, just like we did in our relationship building. And 7, why would whom be interested in participating in the Word and Sacrament ministry of our congregation through this activity? It goes back to considering the whom's perspective. You know, they may or may not see a need here, but we know this, that the Word and Sacrament ministry of our congregation meets the unmet need of all people. How are you presenting that wonderful gift? You know, here is the need. This is the great need of every non-church person. Are we presenting it in a way that's appealing, or are we making it something that's unappealing? You know, so consider from the whom's perspective why they would want to get involved in the Word and Sacrament ministry of our congregation. Present it as it is, a beautiful, wonderful gift of God's grace for the whole world, and especially even for this whom. In our case study, we want to go back to our friends at St. John by the Sea and see what they did here with their outreach activities. Now, you remember that Dollars and Cents was the outreach gateway that they chose to reach their whom, which were the non-church women who are married with young children. And they came up with a list of activities. Now, one thing they did is they went back to their outreach funnel, way back to what we did in exercise 2. And they looked at the outreach funnel and say, hey, are there things that we're already doing that would actually be good and useful outreach activities for women attending Dollars and Cents who are married with young children? And then they also thought through some other new activities that weren't on the outreach funnel, and these are the things that they identified as potential outreach activities that they can use in conjunction with, alongside of the Dollars and Cents class. And then they started to evaluate them. Now, something that's really key in terms of process is to think through, all right, here's an outreach activity. Which of the questions do I need to ask myself about this activity? Well, the first step in figuring out which questions to ask is to classify the outreach activity. So go back to our decision tree. Remember our decision tree that helped us classify what kind of activity this is? That's the first step. So they took marriage enrichment class, and they looked at it and they evaluated it and determined that marriage enrichment class was a nurture relationships activity. That's where it fit in the outreach process. So now, once they've identified that that was a nurture relationships activity, they could ask the appropriate questions. In this case, questions 3, 4, and 5. And based on that, they determined, yes, this would be an effective outreach activity for the whom that we're considering. So they circle that on the little sticky note, and they have that ready to go to the outreach pathway. Actually, what they do then is the same thing with each of those outreach activities that they identified, and put them on the outreach funnel so they were classified so they could see where things fit together. And this is the resulting outreach funnel for St. John by the Sea in their efforts to use dollars and cents as a gateway for outreach activities for women who are married and have young children. You see, some of them didn't make it onto the funnel because they determined they really weren't good outreach activities for this particular whom. So this is a way of organizing all those ideas and thoughts and classifying them and getting ready to produce the outreach gateway. In exercise 5, now you're going to work through that same process of identifying outreach activities and then evaluating them according to the key questions that will help you determine which of those activities are good and effective outreach activities for the whom that you've selected.